Let's talk about culture. What are the components of a high-performing culture? And when you're involved in a culture that you want to move and change and tweak in a different direction, how do you do that as a leader?
Ambition. I mean, such an important aspect of anyone's life and any company's intent. I think you've got to have a realistic ambition for your company. The second one is risk. There's not going to be reward without risk. And I think you've got to understand, size it, price it, and pursue it. So I think you should not shy away from risk. You should actually embrace it. So I think a lot of companies, what they spend a lot of time, is they're risking all the time, which I can understand, and I think it's part of any company's fiduciary roles and duties. But I think at the same time, facing and defining risk and embracing it to a degree that you can actually understand, and as long as you understand it, you should really embrace. When you have a culture that it's ambitious, when you have a culture that looks at risk with a mind to play to win as opposed play not to lose, you certainly start having a culture that wants to accomplish things.
Yeah, that's a great statement. Playing to win as opposed to playing not to lose. You may have noticed that there are now 3 fewer global American food companies, and there are now 3 new global Brazilian food companies. There must be some nationalistic pride. Tell me, what have the Brazilians brought to these companies from their global perspectives that seemingly, and not to overgeneralize,
Sure,
that the previous managements of those great global companies were missing?
I think complacency was pretty much ingrained in many of those companies. And I think that's a challenge for large companies. I don't think it's a question of the Brazilians. I mean, what I think this culture of this particular investor has basically focused on is performance and high performing teams and having compensation completely aligned to very few targets and being absolutely relentless around what needs to happen from a productivity point of view. Big companies in big countries, particularly when they've been successful for so many years, complacency gets ingrained in the DNA. And what you have is a disruptive new owner who comes and basically says, well, I think we can do better. So I think at the root cause, ambition and an ability to take risks. I go back to that sort of thing about high-performing teams. Ambition and risk are very, very closely correlated. And these new investors come with a lot of ambition. They're taking a lot of risk. In some cases, they're doing that with debt. So they've got to make sure that in a couple of years, they're going to be able to bring the company to an optimal capital structure. But they don't get confused with the real task, which is performance.
You've lived in Europe, you've lived in Asia, you've lived in the United States, and although you're a Brazilian, you've spent most of your time everywhere else, but more recently now in Brazil. How do you define diversity?
I don't think I can define. What I think it is people with very significant different backgrounds that can very much enrich the dialogue that is taking place in the company. I think what you don't want to have in a boardroom or with your management team is just a bunch of people who just came from the same school, from the same community, with the same values. It's very comfortable, but it's not necessarily very conducive to disruptive thought process. I mean, we are living in a world, going back to the digital threat, I mean, many business models are being disrupted as we speak, constantly. We've got to have people with not only different cultural backgrounds, but academic backgrounds. I think you may very well be, as I've been in many companies in the agricultural space, strong marketing background, strong digital background. You don't necessarily have to go through just, agronomics to be a good and effective leader. And the same applies to the financial industry. The same applies to any industry for that matter. I think diverse academic and cultural backgrounds are absolutely vital in a world that is changing so fast.
Yeah, so you have a very broad and expansive definition of diversity.
I do, and if I may just expand on that one, Pat, for example, if you look at the U.S. food companies in general, or if you look at some American firms, this has been and continues to be the most important market in the world scene, and that's not going to change for the foreseeable future. But what that has created is in some cases, the inability to have devoted time and resources to create the skill set to look at the world and seize opportunities somewhere else. How many US food companies have actually become truly international? It wasn't because they didn't have the resources, the capital, or even the right boards to steer them in that sort of thinking process, but they weren't able to create the cultural fabric and the skill set with people that would be able to give them so many different perspectives in analyzing the Asian opportunity, the South American opportunities, last challenge, depending which sectors you're operating. So people really failed. Look at the US airlines, for that matter. I mean, is the world scene going to be defined for a US airline in the US? Definitely not. Look what's happening with the Middle East carriers. So the world is becoming not very much interchangeable, and the so-called developed world has developed a sort of or has maintained a culture that it's of doing the same better each and every year without necessarily challenging and adding other skills, incubating very vital skills to play in different markets in an effective manner. It's learning how to crack the code in markets where you are completely uncomfortable, but still be able to do business in a way that you are comfortable.
So let's talk about sort of the next generation of talent. We call them millennials. What are your thoughts on leading this new group of young people into this brave new global climate?
Not so sure I'm totally equipped to give you that answer. I think people are geared and driven towards accomplishments. They may not be necessarily financial accomplishments, but I think the millennials working today in Apple, I'm sure they're pretty proud. I mean, Apple has basically redesigned the way human beings communicate with one another. How much more profound could that be? Besides, performance just follows. Financial performance is a consequence of a really true phenomenal intent. I think where they can actually help companies is finding answers to problems that we do not even see. I mean, human beings are attracted by problem solving. And I think millennials probably will help us in finding problems that we don't even realize we have them. And I think Apple has been a classic case of showing mankind, that we actually had some problems we never realized we had those problems, and they came with the solutions. And guess what happens to the response? So I think they're going to help us to find problems we haven't really figured out we have them.